In the Middle Ages, some people were paid to climb into pits filled with years of human waste. Others stood in vats of collected urine for hours, every single day. And during the plague, entire crews were hired to drag bodies from the streets with hooks. These weren't crimes, they weren't punishments. These were jobs. And the people who did them kept medieval civilization alive, while civilization pretended they didn't exist. We like to romanticize the Middle Ages, knights, castles, feasts, and tournaments. But beneath that polished surface, medieval society ran on the labor of people history would rather forget. People who did jobs so filthy, so dangerous, and so degrading that entire communities refused to live near them. These are the worst jobs in medieval history, and some of them will genuinely shock you. Let's start underground, because that's exactly where gong farmers spent their lives. Medieval cities had no sewage system. Instead, they had cesspits, huge underground chambers dug beneath homes, streets, and castle grounds, where all human waste collected for years at a time. And when those pits filled up, someone had to empty them. That someone was the gong farmer. They worked exclusively at night. The law required it, to spare the population from witnessing what was happening beneath their feet. Using ropes and buckets, gong farmers descended into those pits. They shoveled waste by hand, loaded it into carts, hauled it beyond the city walls to designated dumping grounds called, with grim honesty, lay stalls. The methane gas alone could kill you. Several gong farmers suffocated in the pits before they even realized what was happening. Others drowned, not in water. They were paid relatively well for the era, because no one else would do it. Society tolerated them, but they were required to live outside the city. Their presence, their smell, their very existence was considered an offense. They kept medieval civilization from collapsing, and they were exiled for it. But even the gong farmer didn't have the most disgusting job in medieval society. Before cloth became clothing, it had to be cleaned and thickened. The process was called fulling, and the most effective cleaning agent available in the medieval world wasn't soap, it was urine. Fullers collected urine from households across the city, sometimes in large public vessels placed on street corners specifically for this purpose. They used it to treat raw wool and cloth. The process required the fuller to stand in a large vat of this collected urine and tread the cloth underfoot for hours, sometimes the entire working day. The ammonia broke down grease and oils. It worked. But the smell saturated everything: their clothes, their skin, their hair, their homes. No matter how much a fuller washed, and washing in the medieval period was limited, the odor never fully left them. Like gong farmers, fullers were pushed to the edges of towns, their workshops banned from city centers. They were necessary, skilled craftsmen, and they were treated like outcasts. But standing in urine all day wasn't even the worst job in medieval Europe. What came next in the production chain was something else entirely. Leather was one of the most important materials in the medieval world. Armor, shoes, saddles, belts, books, all of it required leather, and leather required tanners. The process began with raw animal hides, still carrying flesh, fat, and hair. Those hides were first soaked in a solution of water and animal dung, dog excrement, pigeon droppings, whatever was available. This loosened the hair so it could be scraped off by hand. Then the hides were submerged in vats of tannin, liquid made from rotting bark, for months at a time. The smell of a tannery was, by all historical accounts, almost incomprehensible. Travelers described detecting a tannery from more than a mile away. Cities across medieval Europe passed laws forcing tanneries to operate downwind and downstream from the general population. Tanners developed skin conditions, respiratory diseases, and chronic infections. Their life expectancy was noticeably lower than other tradespeople. Their hands were permanently stained, permanently damaged. And yet, every soldier in armor, every priest with leather-bound books, every peasant in worn shoes, all of them depended on those ruined hands. The work was horrific, but at least it was a trade. Some medieval jobs didn't even have that dignity. Medieval cities were overrun with rats. Rats destroyed grain stores, contaminated water supplies, spread disease through everything they touched. And so men, sometimes young boys, were hired to catch them. With their hands, with crude traps, occasionally with small dogs or ferrets sent into the dark. Rat catchers moved through the filthiest spaces in the city: sewers, cellars, grain stores rotting with mold and moisture. They were bitten constantly. Rat bites in the medieval period regularly led to infection, fever, and death. There were no antibiotics, no treatment beyond prayer and luck. Some rat catchers became semi-legendary in their towns, but most lived on the fringes, paid per rat, surviving on wages barely enough to eat, while the rats they hunted fed on the city's abundance. And then things got worse, much worse, because the rats didn't just bring disease, they brought the plague. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. Over the next 5 years, it killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire continent. Cities filled with the dead faster than the living could process them. Someone had to collect the bodies. Plague body collectors moved through streets lined with the dying. They loaded corpses onto carts, often using long hooks to avoid direct contact, though direct contact was unavoidable. They transported the dead to mass graves outside the city walls, where bodies were stacked in layers and buried under lime. Most plague collectors died. The disease spread through contact, through breath, through the very air that surrounded the dead. Some collectors wore crude masks stuffed with herbs, believing the smell of sickness was the sickness itself. It wasn't enough. They died doing the work that kept entire cities from becoming open graves. And yet, as long as desperate people could be found, driven by payment or the belief that God had already chosen their fate, the collections continued. Every morning, every street, every cart. This is where the story takes a disturbing turn. Because even surrounded by that scale of death, some jobs carried a different kind of darkness. Medieval medicine ran on the theory of humors. Illness was caused by imbalances in the body's fluids. The cure, more often than not, was bloodletting, and the preferred tool for bloodletting was the leech. Leech collectors waded into swamps, marshes, and stagnant ponds, often barefoot, bare-legged, and allowed leeches to attach to their skin naturally. Once the leeches fed, they were carefully removed and stored for sale to physicians and barber surgeons across the city. The work meant constant blood loss, constant open wounds on the legs and feet, constant exposure to whatever else survived in stagnant medieval water, bacteria, parasites, infection. Some collectors developed severe anemia over time, slowly drained month by month by the very creatures they harvested. They were paid poorly. Their product was considered medically indispensable. They themselves were considered nothing. On the surface, the executioner seems powerful, feared, certainly. But the reality of the medieval executioner's life was something closer to a curse. In many European cities, executioners were forbidden from entering churches, from touching food at market stalls, from sitting beside ordinary citizens in taverns. Their children were denied entry to guilds, to trades, to any path toward a normal life. The job demanded a grotesque and precise skill. Beheadings, hangings, public torture, all performed in front of crowds expecting a clean, efficient display. A botched execution was a humiliation. Sometimes it was punished. Some executioners inherited the role by birth alone, trapped in the profession by family name, with no legal path to leave it. Society needed them. Society despised them. And then there was a job that carried no blade, no pit, no vat of urine, just a plate of bread and a lifetime of spiritual contamination. When a person died in medieval Britain, particularly someone who had sinned greatly or died suddenly without confession, a sin eater would be summoned. They came to the home of the deceased. A plate of bread and a bowl of ale were placed on the chest of the corpse. The sin eater consumed them. In doing so, they symbolically absorbed the sins of the dead, allowing the soul to pass safely into the afterlife. In exchange, they received a small coin, and then they were told to leave. Sin eaters were considered spiritually contaminated, carrying the accumulated weight of every soul they had ever eaten for. They were feared, avoided, refused entry into churches, the one place in the medieval world that offered comfort and community to everyone else. Called upon in grief by the very people who would not speak to them in daylight. They offered absolution. They received exclusion. History remembers kings, it remembers battles, it remembers empires, but it almost never remembers the people who kept those empires from drowning in their own filth. The gong farmer who descended into the dark so the city could wake up clean. The tanner whose poisoned hands kept soldiers armored and priests literate. The plague collector who walked willingly toward death every morning, every street, every cart, so that others might have something resembling a burial. These people lived at the very bottom of a brutal world. They were paid barely enough to survive, kept at the edges of society, close enough to be useful, far enough to be forgotten. And history forgot them almost entirely. But civilization would not have survived without them. And tomorrow morning, somewhere in the medieval world, a man will climb back into the pit. No gloves, no mask, no protection. Just the work that needed doing.